Upper Arkansas Valley, Colorado, September 1889. The aspen groves were a wildfire of gold against the dark pine, a final, defiant spectacle before the long, white silence of winter. Down on the valley floor, men were chinking cabins, splitting wood and laying in supplies, their movements dictated by an ancestral fear of the cold that would soon pour down from the high peaks. And then there was Emrys Bowen. He was doing something else entirely, something that made seasoned men stop their work, lean on their axe handles, and stare. Bowen, the quiet Welshman who had arrived the previous spring, was nailing garbage to the inside of his cabin. Not just any garbage. He was meticulously covering every square inch of his interior log walls with flattened tin cans. He had spent the summer collecting them, trading a mended bucket or a sharpened tool for the empty tins from the general store and the mining camps. Now, with a small hammer and a pouch of nails, he was creating a strange, patchwork mirror of metal inside his home. The low autumn sun, slanting through the single window, caught the polished surfaces and threw dazzling, chaotic reflections across the dirt floor. Orrin Tuft, owner of the valley's general store and the closest thing the settlement had to a banker, rode his horse to a stop near the Bowen claim. He was a man whose confidence was built on inventory and accounts receivable. He saw the world in terms of what was practical, what was profitable, and what was proven. Bowen's project was none of those. "Bowen," Tuft called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who controlled the flow of flour and credit. "What in God's name are you doing to that cabin?" Silas Croft, a carpenter whose hands had helped build half the structures in the valley, was already there, shaking his head slowly. "It's madness, Orrin. Pure madness." Emrys Bowen emerged from the doorway, blinking in the bright light. He was a compact man, with the dense, muscular build of someone who had spent a lifetime working with heavy metal in tight spaces. He wiped a smudge of soot from his cheek with the back of his hand. "I'm making it warm, Mr. Tuft." Tuft let out a short, incredulous laugh. "With tin? Son, that's the damnedest foolishness I've ever seen. That metal will draw the cold in. It'll sweat and rot your logs from the inside out. You'll have mice and pack rats nesting between the tin and the timber before the first snow. It's an invitation to vermin." Silas Croft nodded in solemn agreement. "He's right, Emrys. Wood holds the heat. A good thick log wall, properly chinked. That's what keeps a family alive up here. Not this shiny nonsense." Bowen looked from the store owner's dismissive face to the carpenter's concerned one. He glanced back into his cabin, where his wife, Nia, was hanging a blanket over the doorway to the children's small sleeping loft. He turned back to the men. "The wood loses the heat," he said, his Welsh accent softening the edges of his words. Then he turned and went back inside, the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of his hammer resuming moments later. Tuft watched the cabin for a long moment, a frown deepening the lines on his face. This wasn't just eccentricity. It was a willful rejection of established wisdom. It was a risk, and Orrin Tuft did not like risks, especially when they were tied to his ledger. The mockery that had been light-hearted curiosity for weeks had now hardened into serious doubt. The word whispered around the campfires and over the counter at the store was no longer strange. It was foolish. What did this Welsh tinplate worker, a man from a damp island of green hills and coal smoke, understand about the physics of a high-altitude freeze that a lifetime of frontier survival had taught Orrin Tuft and Silas Croft to miss? The answer to that question would not be found in argument or debate. It would be delivered by the brutal, impartial judgment of a Colorado winter, a winter that was already gathering its strength in the frozen heart of the continent. The physics of heat and cold do not care about conventional wisdom. They care only about what works. If you stick with me for the next few minutes, I promise you will learn something fundamental about how your own home loses heat. A principle that was understood by a humble craftsman a century before it became common knowledge in building science. And perhaps you'll consider subscribing to this channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Emrys Bowen was not a carpenter. He was not a frontiersman, a trapper, or a farmer. He had never learned the specific language of log construction, the subtle art of the saddle notch, or the proper mix of mud and moss for chinking. Before arriving in Colorado, the tallest trees he had seen were the oaks of his home valley, ancient and gnarled, not the colossal lodgepole pines that marched up the slopes of the Rockies like a silent army. His world had been one of fire, metal, and immense roaring heat. He was a tin plate worker from the Taff Valley in South Wales, a place where the rivers sometimes ran orange with industrial runoff, and the sky was smudged with the perpetual haze of the furnaces. His hands, calloused and scarred, knew the feel of tongs gripping a white-hot ingot. They knew the precise pressure needed to roll steel into whisper-thin sheets and the acrid smell of the molten tin bath that coated them. His expertise was not in keeping the cold out, but in keeping intense heat in. The objects of his trade were reverberatory furnaces, annealing ovens, and the great brick-lined chambers where heat was a tool, a force to be contained and focused with brutal efficiency. He understood that the most powerful barrier to heat was not always thick, but reflective. The linings of his furnaces weren't just fire brick. They were designed with surfaces that bounced thermal energy back into the crucible, concentrating the inferno, wasting not a single degree. He and Naya, with their 2 children, Rhys and Bronwyn, had come to America not for gold, but for air. The doctor in Merthyr Tydfil had been blunt, gesturing toward the soot-stained window. The boy, Rhys, had a persistent cough, a weakness in the lungs that the coal-dusted air was slowly turning into something fatal. The prescription was clean, dry, high-altitude air, so they had sold what little they had, crossed an ocean and a continent, and landed in the upper Arkansas Valley, a place with more sky than they had ever imagined. Their first winter, in a hastily built cabin provided by the mining company that gave Emrys work repairing ore carts, was a lesson in a new kind of physics. It was a cold so profound and invasive, it felt like a living entity. The card from the doctor in Wales had spoken of healing air. It had not mentioned that this same air could freeze a man's soul. They had 2 stoves, a cook stove in the main room, and a smaller potbelly in the sleeping area, and they burned through wood at a terrifying rate. Their first winter was a blur of sawing, splitting, and feeding the fire. Emrys felt like he was trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The heat simply vanished. The worst part was the mornings. They would awaken to a beautiful, lethal artistry. A delicate lacework of frost would have grown overnight on the inside of the log walls, a crystalline map of every tiny gap in the chinking. The water bucket beside the door was always skinned with a half-inch of ice. Naya would have to thaw the pump handle with a kettle of hot water before she could make coffee. Emrys found himself waking every 90 minutes, a clockwork of dread, to feed the ravenous stoves. Any longer, and the fire would die down to embers, the cabin's temperature would plummet, and the frost on the walls would begin its silent, creeping advance across the room. Rhys's cough had returned, a dry, rattling sound in the frozen stillness of the pre-dawn dark. Emrys knew he had traded one threat for another. He had escaped the smothering dust of the mines for a cold that was just as deadly. That winter, he spent hours just watching the cabin, studying it not as a home, but as a failed machine. He watched how the heat from the stove seemed to radiate outwards, hit the dark, rough-hewn log walls, and simply disappear. The The logs on the inside would feel barely lukewarm to the touch, while outside, a light snow that had fallen on the cabin roof would melt long before the snow on the surrounding ground, proof that the heat was pouring straight through the structure. The problem wasn't the thickness of the walls, it was their surface. The problem wasn't conduction. The problem was radiation. The other settlers in the valley faced the same battle, armed with the same conventional weapons. Their enemy was the relentless loss of heat, and their cabins were sieves. Silas Croft, the carpenter, had built his own home with a craftsman's pride. He used 12-inch diameter logs, hand-hewn to fit with geometric precision. The chinking was a carefully guarded recipe of clay, sand, and horsehair that dried as hard as stone. By all frontier standards, it was a fortress against the cold. Yet inside, his wife Martha spent her days in a constant rotation of tasks dictated by the stove. She kept a pot of water on it constantly, not for cooking, but to put some moisture back into the desiccated air. Her bread dough had to be left to rise on a stool pulled so close to the firebox it risked scorching. When the temperature dropped below zero, they hung heavy quilts over the windows and doorways, turning their home into a dark, stuffy cave. Their woodpile, which looked mountainous in October, seemed to shrink with alarming speed by January. They were burning nearly a full cord of wood every 2 weeks. The issue was a fundamental misunderstanding of heat itself. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, through direct contact; convection, through the movement of air or liquid; and radiation, through electromagnetic waves. A thick log wall is a decent barrier against conduction. Good chinking is an excellent defense against convection. It stops the drafts. But neither of those things did anything to stop the primary thief of heat in a cabin: thermal radiation. Everything with a temperature above absolute zero radiates energy. The wood stove, glowing cherry red, was a powerful radiator, sending out waves of infrared energy in all directions. When these waves struck an object, they either bounced off or were absorbed. The dark, rough surface of the interior log walls was an almost perfect absorber of this energy. It soaked up the infrared radiation from the stove, warming the log itself. The log then became a radiator in its own right, sending that same energy outward, through the chinking and into the frozen Colorado air. The family inside was only getting the benefit of a fraction of the stove's heat. Most of it was simply being absorbed by the walls and efficiently passed to the outside. A standard log cabin wasn't a container for heat. It was a transfer station. It was designed unintentionally to warm the forest. Emrys Bowen, the tin plate worker, saw this with the clarity of a man who had spent his life forcing heat to stay where he put it. As the summer of 1889 waned, Emrys began his project. His raw material was the detritus of the frontier: tin cans. Cans that once held peaches from California, oysters from the Chesapeake, or tomatoes from Ohio. In an environment of scarcity, almost nothing was thrown away, but the empty cans were a nuisance. They were everywhere. He became a familiar sight, walking the dusty tracks between the mining camps with a burlap sack over his shoulder, collecting the discarded metal. The work was methodical and laborious. First, he used a heavy set of shears to cut the top and bottom off each can and slit the cylinder down its seam. Then, using a heavy mallet and a flat section of railroad track he'd salvaged, he hammered each piece flat. The tin cans were actually steel with a thin coating of tin to prevent rust. The hammering was crucial. It not only flattened the metal, but also work-hardened it, making it stiff. The next step was the most important. He took the flattened sheets and polished them. Using fine sand from the riverbank and a piece of worn leather, he scrubbed the interior surface of each sheet, the surface that had been in contact with the food, until it gleamed with a dull, silvery luster. He was not aiming for a perfect mirror finish, just a smooth, bright surface, free of the lacquer and grime of its former life. His children, Rhys and Bronwyn, would watch him for hours, fascinated by how their father could turn a piece of trash into a rectangle of captured light. When he had a large enough pile of these small metallic shingles, he began to install them. Starting in one corner of the main room, he nailed them directly to the interior logs. He overlapped each piece by half an inch, like siding on a house, creating a continuous, unbroken metallic skin. The sound of his hammer, a sharp tink, tink, tink against the metal, was a new and curious rhythm in the valley, a counterpoint to the thud of axes and the whine of saws. His wife Nia, who had trusted his judgment across an ocean, watched with a quiet apprehension. "It is very bright, Emrys," she said one afternoon, her voice hesitant. The inside of their small cabin, once a space of warm, shadowy wood, was transforming into a glittering, alien cavern. The reflections were disorienting. A simple movement seemed to create a cascade of light. "It will keep us warm, Cariad," he'd replied, not looking up from his work. "It will not steal the heat." It was during this phase that Orrin Tuft made his decisive visit. He dismounted and walked right up to the cabin, his boots crunching on the wood chips and metal scraps littering the ground. He peered inside. "Bowen, I came to talk sense. I've had 3 other men in the store today talking about your tin palace. Silas Croft says you're ruining good timber." Emrys set down his hammer. "It will be warmer." "It will be a death trap," Tuft countered, his voice sharp with impatience. "That tin will be colder than the grave come January. It will sweat, I tell you. Water will get behind it, freeze, and push your chinking right out. And the vermin! You'll be hearing rats chewing through your logs all winter long. It's unsound. It's reckless." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "I've been carrying you on credit for supplies since July, Bowen. I did it because I thought you were a hard worker. But I can't back a man who is actively trying to destroy his own home. Your credit at my store is finished. You'll pay cash from now on." It was a devastating blow. In a frontier economy, credit was lifeblood. It meant flour, salt, bacon, and lamp oil to get through the winter. Tuft was not just offering an opinion. He was passing a financial sentence. Emrys Bowen's face tightened, but his voice remained level. He looked at the store owner, a man who saw only risk, not physics. "I will pay my debts, Mr. Tuft," he said quietly. Then he picked up his hammer and a fresh sheet of tin. The conversation was over. The tapping resumed. To understand the genius of what Emrys Bowen was doing, you have to understand the invisible world of thermal radiation. Imagine you are standing in a dark room. You can't see anything. Now imagine one wall is heated to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. You still can't see the wall, but you can feel it. The warmth you feel on your face is not from the air, which might still be cool. It's infrared radiation, a form of light that our eyes can't detect, streaming from the hot wall to your colder skin. The cast iron stove in a log cabin was a miniature sun. It pumped out enormous amounts of this infrared energy. The crucial factor that determined what happened next was the nature of the surface that this energy wave encountered. This property is called emissivity. Emissivity is a measure of how well a surface radiates energy, rated on a scale from 0 to 1. A perfect radiator, called a black body, has an emissivity of 1. A perfect reflector has an emissivity of 0. A rough, dark surface, like a pine log, has a very high emissivity, around 0.9. This means it's extremely good at both absorbing and emitting radiant energy. When the infrared waves from the stove hit the log wall, 90% of that energy was absorbed, warming the wood. The wood then immediately began to radiate that heat away. Because the outside of the log was facing the freezing Colorado air, The heat flowed in that direction, lost forever. The family inside only benefited from the heat that radiated from the stove directly to their bodies. The rest was captured by the walls and efficiently ejected from the building. Now consider the surface Emrys Bowen was creating. A bright, polished metallic surface has a very low emissivity. The polished tin he was installing had an emissivity of around 0.1 or even lower. This meant it was a terrible absorber and a terrible emitter. It was, however, an excellent reflector. When the infrared waves from the stove struck the tin wall, they weren't absorbed. Instead, up to 90% of them were reflected right back into the room, just like light bouncing off a mirror. The tin surface acted like a thermal mirror, containing the stove's radiant energy within the living space. The heat waves would bounce around the room, eventually being absorbed by the occupants, the furniture, and the floor, warming them directly. The tin itself never got very hot because it was absorbing so little energy. And because it was a poor emitter, what little heat it did absorb through conduction from the logs behind it, it held on to. It refused to radiate that heat away. Orrin Tuft's fear of the tin being colder than the grave was based on a misunderstanding of how we perceive temperature. When you touch a piece of metal and a piece of wood in the same room, the metal feels colder. That's not because it is colder, they are the same temperature. It feels colder because metal has high thermal conductivity. It rapidly pulls heat out of your hand. But in Bowen's cabin, the tin wasn't meant to be an insulator against conduction. It was a barrier against radiation. By lining his cabin, Emrys Bowen had essentially built a giant thermos bottle. He had created an interior surface that gave back almost all the energy it received. He hadn't stopped the heat at the wall. He had stopped it from ever reaching the wall in the first place. The first week of December, the sky turned the color of lead, and the air grew unnervingly still. The old-timers felt it in their bones. This wasn't the prelude to a normal snowstorm. This was something else. The cold arrived not as a gradual decline, but as a physical assault. On the afternoon of December 6th, the temperature was a brisk but manageable 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it was 30 below zero, a 40-degree drop in 6 hours. An Arctic outbreak had descended on the Rockies, a vast, merciless dome of polar air that would hold the valley in its grip for 11 days. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, life contracted to a desperate, primal struggle for warmth. At the Croft Homestead, the fortress of 12-inch logs felt like a paper shack. The cold knifed through every unseen gap. The fine, powdery snow, driven by a relentless wind, was forced through the window frames, creating small drifts on the interior sills. Martha Croft's bread dough, even on the stool by the fire, turned into a cold, dead lump. They moved their mattress onto the floor in front of the hearth and slept in their coats under a mountain of blankets and buffalo robes. Silas was outside for hours every day, sawing and splitting wood with frantic energy, his breath freezing instantly on his beard. The woodpile that was supposed to last until March was vanishing before his eyes. He was burning through a cord a week, and still the cabin was never truly warm. It was merely less deadly than the outside. At Orrin Tuft's store, in Roishim Wastiksh Star, the windows were opaque with a half-inch of interior frost. The ink in his inkwell froze solid. The molasses in its barrel became a black, unpourable tar. He kept his stove roaring, but anyone who moved more than 10 feet away from it felt the cold seeping into their bones. He slept on a cot in the store, waking every 2 hours to stoke the fire. The thought of his own well-built house a mile away too cold to contemplate. Inside the Bowen cabin, a different reality was unfolding. On the first night of the freeze, Emrys let the stove burn hot until the tin walls shimmered in the lamplight. Then he banked the fire for the night, loading the firebox with 2 large, slow-burning logs of pitch pine. He did not wake again until dawn. When they woke, the cabin was not cold. It was cool, yes, but the air was still and calm. There was no frost on the walls. The water bucket on the far shelf, 15 feet from the stove, had no ice on it at all. Nia found she could work at her small loom without her fingers growing numb. The children, Rhys and Bronwyn, played on a sheepskin rug in the middle of the floor, not huddled by the fire, but simply existing in the space. The small, mundane miracle was the butter on the table. It was firm, but easily spreadable. A detail impossible in any other cabin in the valley, where butter was a frozen, unwieldy brick. The sound of Rhys's breathing was clear and quiet. The cough was gone. Emrys Bowen was burning less than a third of the wood Silas Croft was, yet his family was living in a different climate. The tin walls, which absorbed so little heat, gathered the warmth and held it, reflecting it back endlessly upon them. The 10th day of the freeze was the worst. The temperature at dawn was 42 degrees below zero. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and an eerie ice fog hung over the frozen river. That night, Orrin Tufts stood on the porch of his store, wrapped in every layer he owned, and scanned the valley. He saw the plumes of smoke rising from the scattered cabins, thick, white columns driven straight up into the still, frigid air, a sign of fires burning at their absolute maximum. Then his eyes found the Bowen place, perched on a slight rise, a half-mile away. He squinted. The plume of smoke from their chimney was thin, almost transparent. It was a lazy, ghostly wisp, the kind of smoke a fire makes when it's burning low, when it's been hours since it was last fed. In this cold, a fire like that meant only one thing: it was dying. And a dying fire meant a dying family. A wave of cold dread, far colder than the air, washed over him. His mind flashed to the two small children. He had mocked Bowen. He had cut off his credit. He had pronounced him a fool. And if that fool's pride had led him to freeze his family to death, Tuft knew it would be a weight on his soul for the rest of his life. Cursing his own arrogance, he ran to the stable, threw a saddle on his most sure-footed horse, and rode out into the merciless night. The ride was a nightmare. The horse's breath plumed and froze instantly on its muzzle. The crunch of its hooves in the crystalline snow was the only sound in a dead world. As he got closer, the smoke from the chimney remained faint, confirming his worst fears. He dismounted, his legs stiff and clumsy with cold, and ran to the door, foregoing a knock and throwing it open. He expected to be met with a wave of killing cold, the sight of a dead fire, and a terrible, frozen silence. What he got was warmth. It hit him like a physical blow. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the entire space. The air was calm and still. Emrys Bowen was sitting at his small table, reading a Welsh Bible by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Nia was humming softly as she mended a tear in Rhys's trousers. The two children were asleep in the loft, their breathing quiet and even. The stove was giving off a steady, moderate heat, its firebox door shut, the fire within clearly well-tended but not raging. Tuft stood there, speechless, the brutal -40-degree air from outside swirling around his legs. He stared at the shimmering, impossible walls. He had expected to feel the familiar bite of a freezing cabin. He actually felt a calm, steady warmth on his face, his hands, his entire body. He had expected to see his breath plume in a great cloud. He saw nothing. Emrys looked up, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Tuft, it is a cold night to be out." Tuft could only stammer. "Your fire? Your smoke? I thought—" "The fire is fine," Emrys said simply. "It does not need to shout." Tuft's eyes scanned the room, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with a lifetime of experience. His gaze fell upon the water bucket, sitting on a shelf against the far wall, the wall most exposed to the north wind. He walked over to it as if in a trance. He reached out a gloved hand and dipped a finger into the water. It was liquid, cold, but completely liquid. He pulled his hand back as if burned. In his own store, a bucket of water placed that far from the stove would have been a solid block of ice in hours. He turned and looked at the tin wall, 6 feet from the stove. Tentatively, he pulled off his glove and placed his bare palm flat against the metal. He expected the shocking, painful cold of frozen steel. What he felt was a distinct, undeniable warmth. The tin was warm to the touch. The radiant heat, bouncing off the other surfaces, was warming this wall just as it was warming everything else in the room. His entire understanding of winter survival, of heat and wood and shelter, collapsed in that single, tactile moment. He looked at Emrys Bowen, the quiet man he had ridiculed and financially punished. The man who had been right in a way Tuft couldn't have imagined. "Bowen," Tuft said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was awe, shame, and utter respect. "You didn't build walls. You built a mirror for the fire." When the great freeze of 1889 finally broke, the stories began to travel. The first and most powerful messenger was Orrin Tuft himself. He restored Emrys Bowen's credit and added a public apology, telling everyone who came into his store about the night he rode up expecting to find a tomb, and instead found a small pocket of summer. He described the liquid water and the warm tin walls with the zeal of a convert. But the real agents of the idea's spread were the freight drivers. These were the men who hauled supplies up and down the Arkansas River Valley, connecting the mining camps, ranches, and small settlements. When they stopped at the Bowen place to drop off goods now paid for by Tuft's credit, Emrys would invite them in to warm themselves. They would step out of the biting wind and into the steady, even warmth of the tin-lined cabin, their eyes going wide at the glittering walls. They would ask questions, and Emrys, in his quiet way, would explain the principle. They carried the story with them. In Leadville, in Salida, in the remote camps deep in the mountains, they spoke of the shining cabin and the Welshman who had figured out how to trap heat. The idea was simple, the materials were cheap, and the proof was undeniable. By the following spring, 7 families in the valley had begun lining their own cabins with flattened tin. By the winter of 1890, there were nearly 24 tin-lined homes in the region. The reports that filtered back to Orrin Tuft's store were all the same. Fuel consumption cut by more than half. Cabins that were warmer at 20 below than they had ever been at 10 above. The technique Emrys Bowen stumbled upon through the practical knowledge of his trade was a frontier precursor to modern building science. A century later, construction material suppliers would sell radiant barriers, thin sheets of aluminum foil designed to be installed in attics and walls. These barriers work on the exact same principle as Bowen's tin cans. Their low emissivity surface reflects infrared heat, keeping homes warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. Emrys Bowen, with his hammer and heap of discarded cans, had engineered a high-performance building envelope that wouldn't become standard practice for another 100 years. There is a simple, profound lesson in the shimmering walls of that Colorado cabin. Orrin Tuft saw a surface that would sweat and draw the cold. He saw weakness and decay. Emrys Bowen saw a surface that would give back. He understood that in the unforgiving mathematics of survival, what you keep is determined by what you refuse to give away. The dark log walls were generous to a fault. They absorbed all the heat they were given and passed it on freely to the frozen world. The tin, in its strange, reflective selfishness, absorbed almost nothing and gave back everything it received. And in doing so, it lost nothing. It held the warmth, preserved the family, and transformed a shelter from a place of shivering survival into a place of life. It's a principle of physics, but also a metaphor for resilience. True strength is not always found in thick, absorbent walls, but sometimes in a simple surface that knows how to reflect the energy it has been given, keeping the vital warmth alive inside. If you found this story of historical ingenuity as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten innovators. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other simple, low-tech solutions have you seen that have a major impact? Thank you for watching. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative purposes. However, the techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices and physics. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.